Hello, good afternoon everybody and welcome to Infinite Learning's webinar for today. My name is Rebecca Anand. I am the co-founder and managing partner of Infinite Learning. We are delighted today to welcome to our webinar Dr. Leslie Hunter. She's going to be speaking today about the School Leader Inventory. It's a training resident facilitators to build leadership capacity in your own school. Now, the School Leader Inventory is a revolutionary piece of research based on a framework that redefines school leader behaviour. And the aim around this programme is that you'll be able to build capacity for leadership development and behavioural change in your own school by training some of your own staff as a resident SLI facilitator. Leslie will obviously, during the course of this webinar, give you a lot more detail on what exactly that is and how that looks and how it will work. But suffice to say, Leslie has done an enormous amount of research in this field and in leadership. She's highly experienced. She's also a joy to work with, and I know you're going to enjoy today's session. Now, before I hand over to Leslie, just a few small areas of housekeeping. All attendees, we had nearly 200 register for this session, so obviously you're all on mute automatically and cameras are off. It's a webinar rather than an interactive session at this stage. But if you do have any questions as we go through, please put them in the chat section and we will answer those questions at the end in a live Q&A, myself and Leslie. So please, if anything comes up, just pop a question in there and we will definitely address that at the end of the session. Other questions that often come up: will I receive a recording of the webinar? Yes, that will be sent to you automatically tomorrow at 5 p.m. along with a short survey. So if you can give us some feedback, we'd be most grateful. And there'll also be a certificate for all those that have registered. In addition to that, we will send you an email straight after the session today, which will give you links to the course related to the webinar and also a copy of today's PDF. So don't worry about taking loads of notes. There's a copy of the PDF that Leslie has kindly shared with us. Okay, that's enough from me. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, take loads of notes. Take loads of notes. Well, I'm delighted to be here talking to you all today. A joy to work with. Thank you for that, Rebecca. It's been 6 years. You reminded me last time I spoke to you that we've been working together. So what I'm going to do with you today is I am going to talk to you about the School Leader Inventory, as Rebecca has said. And I'm going to introduce you to this and explain a little bit about how it came about, where it came from, and in particular what it can do for you as an individual leader in your school, but also as a group, a team of leaders, and the school as a whole. And this is why I'm saying do take notes, because you should be able to go away today with some opportunities for yourself in terms of reflection. Right, let's make sure this works. So we're talking about the School Leader Inventory. I'm going to be referring to it as the SLI throughout, purely for brevity. But this is a research-based framework, and it is supported by an online diagnostic and a series of tools, a toolkit. And this toolkit is drawn from a wide range of disciplines. So coaching, NLP, psychology, emotional intelligence, a whole range of different disciplines. But these have been drawn together to be the specific tools and techniques that are relevant for schools and school leaders. And if I can explain to you now, before I go into detail on the SLI itself, if I can look back at the background and some of the theory and the practical questions that I was asking that underpin the development of the SLI. Because I've worked in education for over 40 years. Yes, I am that old, unfortunately. For at least 13, 14 of those, I was a lead inspector in the UK, and I also trained Ofsted inspectors in the UK. And then for about a further 20 years, I've worked as a coach and a consultant focusing specifically on school improvement, school effectiveness, and self-evaluation and leadership development in schools, from the UK across through into the Middle East, where I lived and met Rebecca, Paola, and Infinite Learning. Now, throughout all of this time, my focus has been very much on the school effectiveness and school improvement. But the question I've always been asking is, how do we help the leaders in the school on a day-to-day basis in terms of promoting and building their own capacity within the school? So let's have a little look at some of the research areas that back this up. Because if we look at school effectiveness, one of the things that struck me was that when we talk about school effectiveness, our focus is on the whole school. So we're looking at the school as a single entity, and we're looking at the way that the school is operating as an organisation. Therefore, that means that our key attention tends to be on the quantitative data and the student outcomes in the school. So when we're looking at school effectiveness, and this is a phrase that gets used regularly in literature, in journals, in discussions with schools, what we're really saying is we're measuring the progress a school is made in terms of its student outcomes over a period of time, and the destination it's heading towards, which is, can we categorize your school as being effective, and what would that mean? Now, that's in contrast to a different phrase which quite often gets confused with school effectiveness, and that's school improvement. And the difference is that improvement focuses within the school on the teachers, the individual teachers, their work, and the processes that the school is operating. So it's much more qualitative, and it also tends to take into account the perceptions and the views of a much wider range of stakeholders. It's not that very hard, fast measurement that you often get through school effectiveness. So as a consequence, we're much more interested when we talk about school improvement about the journey that schools go on and how they have changed, what they've done, and what the impact of that change is, with a developmental aspect to promote the classroom knowledge of the practitioners in the school. And this takes me back to my very, very early days as an inspector, because I always held the belief that nobody should ever be in a position to come into your school and tell you something that you don't already know. And more to the point, the actual development that can take place through having that conversation and dialogue with an external agency or body can be some of the most profound and powerful professional development that you can have as a school leader. So with that as the backdrop, I've got 3 sets of key questions I want to ask you now. I want to ask you, how effective is your school? Bearing in mind what I've just said by the definition of school effectiveness. And then how would you evidence that? How do you know? And then what does your school need to do to improve? And let's add a 3rd dimension in. What role would self-evaluation play in your school's development? And how does that self-evaluation drive both your school improvement and your effectiveness? So where, in all of this, where does self-evaluation actually sit? Well, if I take you back about 10, 15 years, yes, I am that old, I was doing a lot of work looking at self-evaluation and how schools provided authentic, evidence, school-based self-evaluation, typically to an external stakeholder such as an inspection team. And what I discovered was that school effectiveness and school improvement, and if you go back into the research and academic literature for the last 20, 25 years, you'll find that they tended to be 2 entirely separate entities. And it's only in the last 10 to 12 years that they've started to come together. And these two disciplines now are starting to develop in unison rather than being disjointed or parallel disciplines. And school improvement and school effectiveness has now started to be joined with school self-evaluation. So key questions we need to be asking if we look at that picture is, what does that mean in terms of the self-evaluation supporting a school for its effectiveness and its improvement? And what you'll find is that if you look at the literature that's out there, school self-evaluation tends to be top down when we talk about school effectiveness. In other words, it flows through some form of external quality assurance mechanism, typically inspection or curriculum validation, and it's centered then down into the school around accountability. School improvement, self-evaluation typically flows from the bottom up, and it's driven from within the school. So that then leads us to the question of, what does that mean for school leadership and school leaders? And this is where I have a very, very strong underpinning philosophy that has been the bedrock of everything on which the SLI has been established. And that is that leadership is a process. So if you think about your school, and we're talking about self-evaluation, all of the things that you do, all of the processes are part of your leadership. And you can have the best processes in the world, but it's the leaders, the people, who have to implement and put those processes into practice. So just talking about leadership and just looking at process is not enough. We've got to build internal capacity through the people. I've seen too many occasions where people have left a school and taken with them so much capacity and left a hole where you have to almost start again. The process hasn't changed, but it's this capacity for people to behave, to have the confidence, the credibility in what they're doing to support the processes, the leadership processes, and in this case, the self-evaluation of the school. So the SLI links the school leader's behaviour to the processes. Add the COVID effect. A unique feature of the SLI is that when you see it in a minute, it balances or looks at the balance of the leader in terms of their own behaviour against their drive for performance, feeding into improvement and effectiveness, and also how they maintain well-being. So against this backdrop, we've got so many challenges in education at the moment. Our context has changed significantly in the last 12 to 18 months. And we've got to ask a question, a basic fundamental question. Is our leadership process still fit for purpose? And what do we need to do in terms of supporting leaders at the level of their behaviour to continue a drive for performance, to minimise the impact of the global pandemic on the outcomes for students and the next generation, but at the same time as maintaining their own well-being? Self-care is going to become critical. Self-care is going to become a key issue for all teachers and all leaders in all schools. And one way to look at that and keep that balance right is to go back to our processes, our self-evaluation, which are driving our improvement and our effectiveness, and ask, how do we make sure we get the right people doing the right things in the right way at the right time and for the right reasons? So this brings us to the SLI. It's a behavioural framework, and I'm going to share how it came about today, initially through research into authentic leadership, and then the behaviours that were needed for leaders to be effective in the 21st century. So although I'm going to show you some colours and some nice pictures today, trust me, there are 4,000 academic articles sitting behind this and a lot of practical research that took place as well. It gave rise to a framework that then became refined specifically for school leaders. And it's been tested with over 600 school leaders at the moment, focusing and framing their contribution to self-evaluation in terms of driving school improvement. So let me introduce you to the SLI. What makes it fundamentally different from other assessment tools, diagnostics and frameworks out there is that right from the start, it recognises the impact of these 4 influencing factors on a leader's behaviour. So what we're saying is that the context within which you are working will influence your behaviour. It's not rocket science, but the context, when your context changes, it will impact and influence your behaviour, sometimes positively, sometimes not. The situation in which you are focusing will have a significant influence on your behaviour. In the case of the SLI, the situation where we frame everything for the diagnostic is a leader's contribution to self-evaluation in their own school. The followers, and I make no apology for using that terminology, because a follower is somebody who will choose to follow you if you lead. The followers will be different people in different situations. Sometimes they may be your colleagues, sometimes they may be your peers, sometimes they may be students, sometimes they may be parents, sometimes they may be other stakeholders, or any combination of those. And the values that you bring as an individual, as a leader, are crucial because you have to also consider how they align with the organisational values and also any other values that come into play depending on the context that you're working in. So at the top level, the SLI has 4 key influencing factors. And these factors impact on 6 dimensions of leader behaviour. Now, this colour coding system flows through everything. It flows through the framework, through the online diagnostic, through the user or the leader's reports, and all the profile charts that it generates. So it's very easy to follow that thread. So at one level, if you do nothing other than start to share the vocabulary, have discussions with leaders in the school, then you're starting to get a consistency of language and terminology. And as they work with the SLI and they see that flowing through, you can then start looking across your leaders, middle leadership, senior leadership teams, and you can start looking for patterns and themes and trends in terms of their development. So we've got these 6 dimensions, and I'll unpick those for you in a moment. But if we build up the framework to the next level, each dimension is built on a series of 3 elements. So we've got a total of 18 behavioural elements. And it's the combination of these 18 elements that will form the basis of a leader's behaviour in that situation with that group of followers against the backdrop of that context at that particular point in time. So am I saying that if you were to think of a different situational focus, or if you were to think about being in a different situation with a different group of followers, and you used the SLI and you took the diagnostic, that you might get a slightly different outcome if you do one iteration of it and then another? And the answer is yes, because these factors influence. And that's critical, because too often people use self-assessments, diagnostics, get a result and then say, oh, that's me. I'm going to label either myself or my behaviour and give myself permission to behave in that way every time, in every situation. The SLI is about saying, hang on a minute, that's how you behaved in that point in time. You have the power to be able to change your behavior. You have the power to be able to develop and expand your behavior. And it's a behavioral change model. And that is a really, really important message that you need to take away. I have had some leaders who have completed the SLI on multiple occasions, focusing on different situations, and it has really opened up their eyes to how they behave and why they are choosing to behave in that way with that group of people, but also how they can then take some of those behaviors and transfer them into different situations. So it's an incredibly powerful tool that can be used in many, many different ways. The other thing that it does is it helps leaders to recognize their behavior in each of those 18 elements so they can learn, and that's why it's attached to a toolkit. They can learn to manage their emotions and their behavior. So that means they can then start again to choose the right behavior to get the right outcome. So today I'm going to unpick these dimensions with you very briefly. This is why I said take some notes, so that I'm going to encourage you to take it away. Start using the framework as a frame of reference for your own school, for your own self as a leader, but for your own school leaders as well. So we'll go around the framework, and we'll start with identity. Now, when we look at identity, what we're basically saying here is, how do people learn to be leaders? And I want you to stop and think about how you became a leader. If you've got any views or comments, stick them in the chat box. If you've got any questions, stick them in the chat box. But I've seen it happen so often. We get very strong classroom practitioners, and then they're given a leadership responsibility. They go on a training course. It helps them to understand the things they have to do. But does it actually teach them how to behave? How do they learn to be a leader? Because identity is about who you are as a leader. And the three behaviors that make up the identity dimension are all rooted in understanding purpose and values and what it means in terms of you being a leader in your own school, and the mindset that you need to bring to that to be able to put that into practice. And if you think about when you did first become a leader, you very probably did what the vast majority of people do, which is you thought about maybe the most inspiring or motivational leader you'd worked with, and you thought, I'll model them. It worked for them. Well, that's great to a point, but that was their behavior, not yours, in their situation, not yours, in their context, not yours. So what we've really got to get to is a much deeper forensic level where we start to look at this concept of positional behavior. In other words, the idea of being a leader coming from you, coming from your own core values. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about taking a mental selfie. That then is your canvas. And on that canvas, you have to create for yourself as a leader, your behavioral blueprint. And you have to stop and step back and say, what are my core values? Where are my red lines? What are my non-negotiables? What are the behaviors that you want to see from yourself and from others as a leader? And what are the things that you simply won't compromise? Honesty, professionalism, trust, transparency. But what does that look like in terms of behavior? So it's about creating a behavioral blueprint that defines the acceptable and the unacceptable behavior so that you as a leader can then live to that. But it goes further. It's about saying, do you actually believe that you can then live up to that blueprint? So it brings into play your personal power, your confidence, your credibility, and your ability as a leader to motivate and to inspire others. So if we put all of that, put that into the self-evaluation in your school, and think about either yourself as a leader or the identity of your different school leaders, it's critical, because this is about ownership of who you are as a leader, which then translates into ownership of your contribution to the process, the leadership process of self-evaluation. And if you want some reflection for tomorrow, think now about yourself and the different leaders in your school, and think about how you learned to actually be a leader and what that means in terms of your identity in relation to your positional behavior, your personal power, and your belief. But you don't lead in a vacuum. So let's have a quick look at the second dimension. The second dimension is the role. And when I ask people, what do we mean by your role? Quite often what I get is this list of things, a whole list of scheduled tasks, activities, or to-do lists. And that's fine, but your role is much deeper again than just your job specification, because your role is rooted in your purpose. If the identity is who you are, the role is, why are you there? Why are you a leader in that situation? What is it that you're responsible for? Not what you do, but what are the outcomes that you're responsible for achieving? And the greater your seniority as a leader in the school, the more likely it is that you're going to be leading others to do some of the activities that actually generate those outcomes. So your role is not a to-do list, it's not a schedule, it's the bedrock of your responsibilities, how well you understand them, how well you can articulate them for yourself and for others and for your teams. But with responsibilities come expectations. So what is expected of you as a leader by others? And again, I don't just mean what is it that you want, what do they expect you to achieve? How do they expect you to achieve it? How do they expect you to behave? And flip that, how do you expect others, people that you lead, to behave? So go back to that selfie. We've got our identity as a leader. And if we were to put a frame or a box around that, that's your role. Wrap it in a box. And think of that box as your role dimension, because what it's doing is it's giving you some structure. And if you're responsible for something and you've set clear expectations, then we need to know where the boundaries are, where those expectations and responsibilities begin and end. And this quite often is where we get into real ambiguity, particularly in relation to self-evaluation in schools, because it can be so complex, it can be such a busy process, and the need for boundary clarity is absolutely critical. I've seen situations in schools where we get significant overlap, overwhelm for teachers, overload, multiple people doing multiple activities that don't really tell you anything you don't already know, or the converse can sometimes be true. It creates gaps, and as a result, you might miss something. So if we think about self-evaluation in a school and we bring together identity and role, the most effective school leaders can clearly articulate their responsibilities, expectations, and boundaries, but they know how they impact on the school performance and outcomes. Remember I said that we'd use the SLI with over 600 school leaders. Well, here's some interesting statistic for you. 42% of school leaders almost always believe in themselves. That begs the question, what about the rest of them? Now, imposter syndrome is a big issue, as we know, in many instances in schools, and that is one of the areas where there are some tools and techniques to support around the identity dimension. But nearly 10% of school leaders in that 600 said they rarely or never do believe in themselves as a leader. That raises significant questions, given the immense scrutiny and pressure that school leaders are going to be under as a result of trying to move forward from this global pandemic. Here's another one. How would you, as a leader, measure up if you were asked this question? And what about the other leaders in your schools? Think about these aspiring leaders, the emerging leaders, your middle leaders, your more established leaders. Think about the context and the change that we've all been through, and this concept of a new breed of leaders required to help us move forward in challenging times. So I'm going to take you very quickly through the remaining dimensions, because if we just took those two dimensions together, there's a lot of work there to scaffold development for leaders in schools. But this framework is holistic, and all of the different elements and behaviors interact with each other. So when we look at attitude, what we're actually saying is it's all about what you do as a leader. And this focuses on consistency, on congruence, and it's about aligning your thinking processes, your critical thinking, problem solving, decision making, all of that with how you communicate that and then turning that into action. So if the identity is the who, the role is the why, think of the attitude as the what. And in the schools with the most effective leaders, they not only have strong communication, but their communication skills are demonstrating their thinking processes, which then translate and align through into action that defines the purpose, the strategic direction, and the expectations. So you can see how the behaviors in the SLI start to align and support some of the processes. The leaders start to align and support some of the leadership in the school. Basically, attitude, think, say, and do. Does everything align? Do you walk the talk? Can people trust you? Are you authentic? Well, 87% of the school leaders believe they do develop trust in their followers, and that is a great statistic. Hold on to that, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But if the pandemic has shown us one thing, it's that the context and things can change like that in an instant. So it highlights the importance of the fourth dimension of agility. And when I use the word agility, a lot of people might think about speed or pace, and that's not what agility is defined as here in the SLI, because we're looking here about how self-aware are you as a leader, and how able are you then to draw on a wide range of behaviors. That goodie bag or repertoire of behavior that you have, can you broaden it so that you are as flexible as possible, so that you can handle different situations, build the resilience that you need to perform effectively. So it's not just about speed of your reaction to change, but it's your ability to take people with you, and while you're doing that, to maintain security and stability as much as possible for them. So yes, we're looking at flexibility, but we're also looking at recognizing what behaviors have worked for you in the past and how they can serve you in the future. So this is where intuition comes in, and particularly for more experienced leaders. How do you strike that balance between intuitive and logical decision making? Because intuition is all about learning from experience, learning from mistakes. How do we give our aspiring, our less experienced leaders time, space, and where necessary, permission to make those mistakes and subsequently learn? And in terms of resilience, it's not just about bouncing back. It's not just about having grit to push through. It's about stepping back. It's about giving yourself headspace, giving yourself time to draw on that intuition and past experience. And most critically, learning, again, through some of the tools and techniques in the toolkit, how to choose how you're going to respond and behave in different situations. Now, let's look at another statistic, because here's a particularly worrying picture for school leaders. Given that we're working in learning organisations, 20% of the school leaders indicated they were afraid of experiencing failure. I can associate with that, but only 29% indicated they regularly reflected to learn from their mistakes. So think about all of the opportunities that are being missed. Think about all of the opportunity to really bring our intuition into play alongside logical decision making to really help us broaden our range of behavior. Here's another one. And this one really does concern me. Only 30% of school leaders believe they have the capacity to manage their own emotional state. I hate to tell you, if as a school leader you don't manage your own emotional state, nobody else is going to do it for you. So this whole balancing behaviors that drive performance and behaviors that support you emotionally and in terms of your well-being are critical. And this is where the SLI, through the way it presents the data or some of the data in the reports, can help you and start to signpost you towards the correct tools and techniques for development. So if we look at the most effective leaders in terms of their agility, we're talking about managing the school, but understanding their strengths and weaknesses, learning from mistakes, and this concept of sustainability of positive outcomes across the whole school community. Now we have two further dimensions very quickly. So make sure you stick any questions in the chat box, but I'll just whiz you quickly through the last two. So fairness, this is about how we interact and engage with others. And yes, we would do a lot of work around integrity and empathy, but one of the key critical elements in the fairness dimension is accountability. And that's because it ties so closely to self-evaluation. Let's look at some statistics. 81% of the school leaders believe they hold their colleagues to account. Great. What about holding themselves to account in relation to their roles, their responsibilities, their expectations and their boundaries? Only 23% of school leaders indicated that they did that. So hopefully what I'm hoping you're seeing now is that this self aspect of self-evaluation is really, really crucial. And that's what the SLI does. It puts self at the heart of everything. It's a self-perception inventory. It raises self-awareness for leaders. It gives leaders the tools to self-regulate their behavior and the way that they feel. And it promotes this whole concept through authenticity of self-leadership before you try to lead others. And again, if we look at the most effective leaders, yes, we can talk about inclusive relationships and shared understandings, but it's this impact and responsibility for outcomes by holding people and more crucially themselves to account that comes to the fore. The final dimension is conflict, and conflict is particularly important in terms not just of the influence and knowing ability to influence others, knowing when and how to compromise, but anticipation is a critical element. Being able to scan, assess the outside external environment and be able to anticipate and have a forward thinking scenario planning dimension to your behavior. And yes, you can learn these behaviors. There are tools and techniques that will support you to do that. Most effective leaders do have anticipatory behaviours. They're alert to changing conditions. And they also recognise potential opportunities, not just for conflict, but also for change and for innovation and for development. So there you have the SLI in a nutshell. That's a whistle-stop tour of something that took many years to establish and develop. But it's so much more than just that framework. The framework is there. If you do nothing other than look at the framework, take the rubric that's associated with it, have the conversations, generate a shared vocabulary across the leadership teams in your school, that is the first step. But alongside the framework, there's an online diagnostic. Individual leaders' self-perception takes them about 5 minutes. It produces a report that they download automatically, including an action plan. It benchmarks their scores and their behaviour against the other school leaders, and that is updated on a regular basis. And as I've said, at present, I think last count it was about 650 school leaders had completed this, all within the frame of your contribution as a leader to self-evaluation in your school. It then delves into the individual behaviours for that specific leader, and you get a range of profiles in the report. So it looks at the balance, particularly between performance and well-being. And then it introduces a 3-stage action plan. Attention stage, focus on short, sharp coaching intervention. Development stage, with a whole range of strategies to support you on a longer-term development pathway. And then your balance stage. But the real power comes from within the school itself. Because I spent my 40 years coming into schools, coaching, consulting, supporting, guiding, cajoling, facilitating, bullying, call it what you want, developing and working with school leaders. But I always then walk out the door. The real secret here is adopt this shared vocabulary, train your own staff, train them to administer the diagnostic, train them to facilitate the developmental process, give them, through the programme, access to the range of tools and techniques and strategies that have been pulled from all of these different disciplines, as I've said, coaching, NLP, psychology, and so many more. Use that to start to build an internal capacity, and then ultimately embed a culture of behavioural change in your leaders in your school that will pay dividends over time. So I am delighted that in partnership with Infinite Learning, you now have the opportunity to train staff as resident facilitators. What does it look like? Well, it's a 6-week programme. It's delivered entirely online. It's very heavily video based, but we've got interview styles, presentation styles, whiteboard scribes, there are audio files, there are lots of downloadable documents and a lot of reflection activities built on a case study and doing the diagnostic yourself as you work through and applying all your learning to yourself and your own profile. And throughout all of that, through the entire programme with the videos, I personally guide you through the facilitation process from start to finish. So by the end of the programme, you would understand the structure of the framework, you'd know how to introduce the SLI to a leader and how to facilitate their completion of the diagnostic. You'd understand a report, a user's report, you'd be able to support the leader in terms of interpreting that, you'd be able to talk to them about their balance between performance and well-being, you'd be able to access all the tools and techniques that will be required to support the 3 different stages of their action plan. And you'd be able also to start looking across a number of leaders and talk to leaders in terms of themes and trends in your school, across your middle and senior leadership teams. Critically, you also have access to a bank of additional materials. So these materials could support your future CPD in school, whether it be related to leadership development, self-evaluation, or school improvement. So the best way for me to explain is probably to give you a very quick taster. I'm going to show you the short introductory video for the last week of the programme, because this recaps what people should know by the time they get to the start of week 6. Well, here we are, week 6, final week of the programme. Let's just recap what you have covered in the previous 5 weeks. We started by looking at the framework. So you now have a good understanding of the behaviours that contribute to the SLI, of the language, the vocabulary, the terminology, to be able to create that shared vocabulary across your leadership teams within the school and to have meaningful discussions around agreed defined behaviours. We then moved on to looking at how the SLI is implemented, in other words, the online diagnostic, what the diagnostic does and how it produces a user profile report. In week 2, we unpicked that report and looked at the different profile charts and the variety of ways in which the user's own scores are presented back to them. We took that a step further in week 3 and looked specifically at maintaining a balance between the performance profile and the well-being profile, and then we looked at the 3 action planning stages of attention, development and balance. In week 4, we delved deeper into some of the tools and techniques that you can use to support a user at the attention stage of their action plan in any of the performance dimensions and elements. And we did a similar activity in week 5, but with the focus there on the well-being dimensions and elements and the tools and techniques that can be used, again, to support an attention stage of an action plan. So in this final week, we're going to bring it all together. I'm going to share with you a Facilitator Handbook, which will provide a master set of resource for everything that you would need to be able to facilitate the SLI in your own school. I'm going to encourage you to reflect back not only on the case study as you have worked throughout the programme, but on your own profile. You've taken your learning at each stage and applied it to your own profile report. So what I want you to do now is to be able to step back and reflect on that in terms of being a user of the SLI system. What is the user experience and how can you therefore as a facilitator ensure the best experience for the users, i.e. the individual leaders in your own school? So we're very nearly at the end. There are some bonus materials, as you know, in a final section following this week, but this really is bringing everything together for you. By the time you've completed this week's lessons, you should be fully confident and capable of taking the SLI into your own school and building the leadership capacity from within for yourselves. And that really is where the power of the SLI starts. Have those conversations, share that vocabulary, create opportunities for leaders to look at their behaviour, initially through their contribution to self-evaluation, but then use the system to look at other situations and help people learn that they have the capacity to be self-aware, self-regulate, and self-lead. I hope you've enjoyed the programme so far. So last time I'm going to say to you, let's roll these sleeves up and let's get started. It referred to some bonus content, and that just gives you a flavour. There's a series of flashcards, a couple of books. The Keep Soaring in itself is a full programme that will support you in terms of self-evaluation, and the challenge, choice, change is a reflective journal based format based around the behaviours in the school leader inventory. So the SLI, it's designed for school leaders, it's tried, it's tested, it works. The question is, are we ready to rise to the challenge? What can it actually do, and how can it support you and your school? Well, we're trying to ensure that school leader behaviour is fit for purpose in this new future landscape that we have. And there are 3 key things that we need to be able to do. In terms of individual leaders, it helps to accelerate development. Leaders can work at their own pace, but they're being given the tools and the techniques they need to establish and develop new behaviours. In terms of schools, working with the SLI, an acceptable school moved to very good over a period of 2 years. A good school moved to very good in the first year and outstanding in the second, and has sustained that as an example. And as I've been saying all along, maintaining well-being. All leaders need to raise their self-awareness and have better coping strategies as we move forward from the current challenging situation. So my challenge to you now, are you ready to take the first step? Are you ready to begin the process to accelerate development, improve performance, and maintain the well-being of the critical leaders in your school in the difficult months ahead? If so, join us and start to do it by building capacity from within. Do it by using the SLI as your framework for future leader and leadership development in your school. There's more information on the actual SLI itself on the website there, but the programme for the facilitators and the resident facilitators is accessible through Infinite Learning. So this is the point at which I would now pass back to Rebecca for any questions. Have a look at the chat box and see if there's anything I can answer. Oh, we don't have any questions, do we?
Now, there are a couple of comments, so I'll come to those. First of all, can I just say thank you, Leslie, and wow, you know, just listening to you there, it really does make one kind of reflect on the complexity of leadership, actually. You know, and one of the comments, in fact, I hope Wayne doesn't mind me sharing, so I think it was there for everybody to see anyway, but I thought if we're talking about self-reflection and self-awareness, Wayne actually said about halfway through your presentation, I was desperate for promotion, he said, but when I got it, I realised I was far too young and inexperienced. And I replied, how very honest of you to share this great self-reflection which demonstrates strong emotional intelligence, and I think many people will be able to relate to your experience. We've worked together, Leslie, on a number of middle leadership training sessions in school, because we certainly in this area, and I'm sure it's the same globally, we often see middle leaders in particular thrust into those positions, and they're keen and they're ambitious and they want that leadership role, but when they get there, have they got those skills for, let's say, holding people to account? It's notoriously difficult for middle leaders to hold people account and to deal with those conflict resolution, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's where, in particular, the SLI, where it supports the middle leaders very strongly, is in that fairness dimension, certainly the identity, but in the fairness dimension, because it's them having that balance of empathy for their colleagues who recently they were feeling they were one of them, but then maybe, unfortunately, and you do have to have some difficult conversations at times with people when you look at accountability. So it's getting that balance right. And although I've talked about it a lot, about performance and well-being, I mean, there isn't enough time to explain it all, but what happens is the way the different dimensions support different parts of the performance and the well-being. So it's about looking at that balance of internal behavior and external behavior with others. And for middle leaders particularly, I would say it's all around the identity, the boundaries, the accountability, and then anticipation.
Yeah, in fact, one of the other comments in the chat box, which was here from, just go back up and find it, from Saba Majid, and she asks a quite pertinent question. Can one be, excuse me, can one be an effective leader without conflict?
The part of the conflict dimension is about recognizing that conflict can be positive and should be positive, and that there are times when, as a leader, it is your job to create the environment for conflict to be that positive conflict. So it's not about saying, I've had a lot of people ask me, why did I use that word, that term conflict? Because a lot of people see it immediately as a negative connotation. And this is where it goes into the research and the sort of the academic underpinning that it is the genuine use of the terminology. But it's about saying that conflict is where you just have a difference. That's what conflict means. You have a difference, whether it is of views, opinions, whatever. It doesn't mean it has to turn into a nasty or an unpleasant situation. It means it challenges you to stop and look at something maybe from someone else's perspective or a different viewpoint. So yeah, I would agree entirely. As a leader, if you're not in a position that you either can, I'm not necessarily saying we all thrive on it, but that you can manage it and at times actually provoke it.
Yeah, we do a lot of work on the NPQ programs around that, on the middle leadership program with Susan Scott and difficult conversations, and it's exactly unpicking that and saying that actually if you go in kind of prepared for that conversation that might be difficult, but trying to remove the emotion and be prepared and have clear evidence, and there's a whole range of tools that one can use. But yes, I think certainly it's something that I reflect on my journey when I became a middle leader, and I think particularly internationally, where often as teachers we often live in the same compounds or the same areas, so we don't have that separation that certainly I experienced when I was teaching in the UK. We all went to work, but then we all went home and we had different separate lives to a much greater extent. And in international settings, we often work very closely and play very closely. Our social lives are very integrated. So when you're suddenly having to hold your mate that you go out with at the weekend to account, that becomes even more challenging.
And that's where, particularly within that conflict dimension, some of the tools and techniques talk about interpersonal conflict as opposed to task conflict, as opposed to emotional, conflict. And it might be worth saying, although I didn't say it there, I'm not just talking about this having been used in UK schools. This has been used significantly in schools in the Middle East. It's been used in Russia, for example. So, this has been used, the SLI has been used in international settings and in international schools in international settings as well. Yeah,
and I think for me it's something that's very close to Infinite Learning's heart. Is kind of first thing on our webpage is about creating that sustainability and that self-improving system. We try and offer training that supports teachers and leaders in schools that they can take back into their workplace and kind of embed that practice and enable them to maintain that and become a self-improving school system, really.
Definitely, it's back to the learning organization aspect. But as I alluded to there, I mean, I've spent too long, if I'm honest, going into schools, working with them, supporting them, walking out, coming back in 5 years later because there's been a change of significant leadership and saying, this is a deja vu for me. Why hasn't this moved on? Now, that might mean I didn't do it right in the first place, so we won't go there. But but you're absolutely right. And the other thing that I've found is that, I mean, a lot of the leaders who I worked with have now moved on elsewhere, and they've taken the philosophy and the vocabulary, but they've taken the philosophy with them. But they've also found that they've had and this wasn't intended, but they've had a shift as well in their personal lives, in that they now are much better able to manage emotion, to manage stress, and particularly have that capacity to very much step out of a situation, assess the situation, and then choose, go back into it and choose how they're going to behave. So this isn't about saying this works in a box in the school and then you go out the school and forget everything about it. This is a behavioral change model. And if you change your behavior, yes, I talked about the influencing factors, but if you change your behavior, it means you've increased your flexibility, which is what this is all about, giving people the tools and techniques to do it themselves.
And a very transformational journey potentially for individuals, and as you say, not just in a work environment but beyond. And I have a quote here from somebody very, very impressive who wrote, "The most effective leaders have sufficient self-awareness to self-regulate their own behaviour and ultimately self-lead before trying to lead others." I wonder which very clever person. But it is absolutely true, isn't it? And we all hear about the importance of self-reflection and self-regulation, but I think actually having a tool that kind of forces you to really delve in and analyse that and come out with some honest answers is incredibly powerful, and has the power within a school, to take that beyond. So I'm just
to do it without labelling. I think that's the other thing that is very important for me, to do it without labelling, because this is based on self and self-perception. The only person who's labeling anything is yourself. And if you don't like the label, fine, change it. But labels stick. I've tried taking labels off the bottoms of new shoes years later. Don't label things, recognize them, and then deal with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really excellent advice. Too many of these kind of analysis testing models do want to try and put you in a segment, don't they? And of course, no one is.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing. In fact, one of the videos, and one of the ones I very nearly used to demonstrate part of the program, has me sticking post-its on my head as labeled. And then I thought, no. But it's, all these different assessments and diagnostics are excellent. The key to anything is it's got to be facilitated correctly. And quite often you see them used in either incorrectly or not in necessarily the way they were intended. And that's why facilitation to me is the key. Give people the tools, let them do it themselves.
I'm just going to wrap things up, so I can see people are having to dash off because it's now gone 5, but just a couple of lots and lots of thank you very much. It's just been so interesting, so much food for thought. Have to leave now, enjoyed the session. There was one kind of question up here. Okay, well, so this is from Sarabjit, and she says it talks about accountability, but what do you do when the person continues to deny it?
Right. Well, this is where you start to get the cross links, because what you have to do as a leader then is to, here we go with the coaching again, what you have to do as a leader then is to step back and say, what is at the root of their denial? Is it that they go back? You've got to look at how the accountability element, which is in the fairness dimension, where else it interrelates with some of the other elements across the framework. And in this instance, it would suggest from what you've said there that it's interrelated to expectations, responsibilities and expectations. So it isn't necessarily working on the accountability, it's working on the articulation and the definition of the responsibilities and the expectations, and then looking at how what the process is that somebody will be held to account. But do they understand what they are being held to account for in the first instance, and the impact of them not doing that? So it's bigger than just accountability. Does that make sense?
It does make sense to me. I'm just thinking, doesn't everybody want a Dr. Leslie Hunter in their pocket that they can pull out in a tricky situation to offer wonderful advice such as that? That's what I was thinking. Okay, and just another comment here, and I think maybe we'll use this just to finish off here. Thank you so much, Leslie. lots to think about. I loved your idea of resilience being more than bouncing back and grit. It really is how we can stop and reflect and manage and respond to the situation or the challenge with more awareness. That was from Sneh. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but thank you for that comment. That's a really nice way to summarize and finish the session today. So thank you for your input, everyone that's joined us. I think we had nearly 75, 80 people here at one point. A few have drifted away, but Leslie, thank you so much. If you would like more information on the programme, obviously you can contact myself. If you've got any questions in particular that aren't answered with the information on the website, get in touch with me, and I can always get in touch with Leslie if I need to. But hopefully, if you visit our website, you go to the asynchronous self-study area, you'll see details on this course. It's now open for bookings, and it will be up and running within the next few weeks. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it beneficial, and certainly, even if you go no further than just having attended today, I'm sure it's given you useful food for thought, which is always what we aim to do. Leslie, thank you so much for your time. And I'll just wish everyone a lovely evening, and thank you and goodbye. Till the next time. Bye.
Bye.